Two Gruppe JG-26 is moving from Germany back to France. The date is 14 August 1944. New pilots Walter Stumpf and Adama Kruse give their perspective of the events. Nachwuchs, or new growth, was the term commonly used for the late war crop of poorly trained replacement pilots. Walter Stumpf only had 180 hours of flight time, with only 20 of those hours being in fighters. This compared to about 450 hours for his American counterparts. It was the opinion of Yacht Corps 2 staff that it was pointless to attack heavy bomber formations, since there was no possibility of destroying enough aircraft to lessen the effect of their bombing attacks. Fighter attacks were to be directed instead at enemy fighter bombers and artillery spotters, as these presented the greatest threat to the Army. The Gruppe quickly grew from 30 pilots to 78. Formation and simulated combat flights were flown. While on the ground, the experienced pilots talked flying constantly, while the Nachwuchs listened intently. There was much to be learned from the old hands, how they had attacked, how they had gotten away. Hoffmann gave this advice to his pilots. If you ever have to bail out, remember that the Americans are known to shoot us in our parachutes. Therefore, free fall to about 200 meters. Only that way can you be sure of survival. On the 5th of July, 1944, Ultra intercepted an order by Reichsmarschall Goering stating that because of the recent high rate of loss of indispensable combat leaders, these men could no longer fly combat missions unless at least the following numbers of aircraft were available. For Staffel leaders, 6 aircraft. For Gruppe leaders, 15. Back in Germany, Two Gruppe JG-26 was busy absorbing its new pilots and preparing to return to the front. On the 12th of August 1944, the pilots of the second Gruppe received their orders to leave Rheinsalon. While the second Gruppe was getting ready to return to action, the rest of JG-26 continued flying missions from Paris. The first and third Gruppen had to absorb their replacement pilots while still engaged in daily combat. Walter Stumpf had no confidence in his navigational skills and stayed very close to his element leader, Unteroffizier Heinz Salomon. Upon arrival at München-Gladbach, Hauptmann Lang praised his pilots. Not a single crash. The pilots from the unit stationed on the field greeted them. On the 13th of August, the pilots were awakened early. There was an accident on takeoff, and a pilot was killed. The remaining pilots were led away by a pilot from the first Gruppe, who promptly got lost. They finally arrived at Saint-Denis, low on fuel. When he landed, a ground crewman informed Stumpf that the cockpit heater had been left on. Stumpf hadn't even known such a thing existed. On the 14th of August, the aircraft didn't form up over the airfield, as the first Gruppe guide had already ordered to depart on course. Unteroffizier Salomon's landing gear was damaged and wouldn't retract properly. He and Stumpf were thus the last to leave the field. Salomon landed again, but Stumpf decided to stay with the mob. Stumpf was by himself in the rear and gave his plane full throttle, as the last one is bitten by the dog. Slowly he caught the others and formed up on Lieutenant Praga. They remained at low altitude. Obergefreiter Walter Stumpf had been assigned to Lieutenant Hans Praga's 7th Staffel. On June 28th, a new Gruppe commander, Emil Lung, replaced the injured Hauptmann Naumann. The 35-year-old Emil Lung was a former Lufthansa pilot and a noted athlete. He gained 159 victories with JG-54, mostly on the Eastern Front. Lung had brought with him from JG-54 an experienced Staffel leader, Lieutenant Alfred Gross, as his wingman. A month earlier, on 9 July 1944, on his first flight, Lung destroyed 3 Spitfires within 6 minutes over Caen. Lung was supposed to be a very lucky pilot. It was said about him that in his entire flying career, he had never had an accident. His aircraft had never even been struck by enemy fire. This aircraft was flown by Adi Gluns, who joined JG-26 in October 1941. At this time, Gluns led the 6th Staffel. Gluns was lucky and never lost an aircraft in combat. At this stage of the war, it was rare for JG-26 pilots to keep victory marks on their aircraft rudders. Gluns did this, as did Josef Priller and Hauptmann Redner, who later led the 7th Staffel. Hauptmann Georg Peter Ader had joined the 6th Staffel on 11 August 1944 from 2 JG-1 as a temporary 6th Staffel leader, as Gluns was in war officer training during this period. Ader had over 45 victory claims at this time, mostly with JG-2. 3 days later, on the 17th of August, the Gruppe made rocket attacks on Allied armor near Dreux, and Ader later received confirmation of his destruction of 3 Sherman tanks. They spotted the Eiffel Tower. The first reports of Indians came from Hoffmann, then Lung, then Prega. Kruse and Stumpf saw nothing and thought only of landing. They were now over Guyancourt, which had been the site of Walter Stumpf's basic training earlier in 1944. The airbase now presented a scene of total destruction. Right beside it was a crude landing ground. All of the Gruppe's Staffels, but the 7th, landed there. The 7th Staffel flew past it to an airfield near Rambouillet. Obergefreiter Walter Stumpf had been assigned to Lieutenant Hans Prega's 7th Staffel, Unteroffizier Adama Kruse to Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffmann's 8th Staffel. Combat missions were flown every day. The 8th Staffel's contribution was usually 4 to 6 planes. We had exactly 16 aircraft and 16 pilots, of whom 8 or 9 were Nachwuchs. Each pilot had been assigned his own Focke-Wulf. Mine was the Blue 6, which I had already determined to be something of a lame pig. Hoffmann nearly always chose pilots with previous combat experience. He always looked right past me, to my great disappointment. Repeatedly there came the report, Indians at blah blah blah. The Nachwuchs saw nothing. It was all very confusing. Suddenly they banked on orders over the radio and prepared to land. Walter Stumpf continues, "Where was the airfield?" Praga and Scharf prepared to land. I was behind them. There, a 190 was landing on a plowed field. That had to be it, but there was an overhead power line. I now saw a gap in the power line. We landed close behind one another, 10 yards apart, arrayed from left to right. I was on the far side and oriented myself with the edge of the field. I put on the brakes and saw nothing in front. Was I heading towards Scharf? I braked sharply and cleared myself to the side. There was nothing in my path. A ground crewman waved me onward. I needed to clear the field. The next plane was coming in. The man was standing in a patch of woods. I taxied towards it. Everyone was waving and shaking their fists at me. I switched off the engine and was told that no one was permitted to taxi into the woods. The aircraft were pushed in by hand, tails first. I had been told nothing of this. The plane was pushed back somewhat and covered with camouflage. Heaven be praised, I was back on the ground. All of our aircraft had now landed and were being covered with tree limbs. Spitfires and Mustangs had already passed over the field, but had not yet spotted it. However, there were too many of us, perhaps 55 aircraft, to stay here for very long. We all reported our clear status or our deficiencies to Praga. My ship, Brown 4, was the only one completely operational. I was well pleased with my aircraft. We received help from the first group as ground crews. I got my gear from my aircraft. The plane was then covered. We got into a bus that had come up and left. 3 observers on the fenders searched the skies. We traveled most cautiously, since the Tommies kept their eyes on every mouse hole. They had a fearsome superiority. There was scarcely a minute in which no enemy aircraft could be seen or heard. So we drove as quickly as possible to our quarters and went inside. At Rambouillet, we lived in a splendid castle with beautiful rooms. There were games, music, and cognac, so we were late to bed. Emil Lung did not consider his second Gruppe fully operational. He scheduled an orientation flight for 15 August. There were more pilots than serviceable airplanes. Walter Stumpf was not picked to fly, so he watched from the ground as another Nachwuch took off in Stumpf's Brown 4. Takeoff was delayed by the tactical situation, but the mission finally got underway. The runway was a field of dry stubble. As the aircraft took off, they disappeared into a huge dust cloud that hung in the air for at least 10 minutes. The 7th Staffel formed up over Rambouillet and flew in formation, de Guyancourt, to join up with the Gruppe. The rest of the Staffel stood on the field, waiting, watching, and smoking. Eight Thunderbolts made a firing pass on Rambouillet Field. Just as they pulled up and started off, the 7th Staffel returned with the rest of the 2nd Gruppe, and Stumpf witnessed his first air combat. It was a small battle, but nonetheless, the howling and shrieking seemed to go on forever. There, a cloud of smoke, a crash. Was it American, British, or one of ours? We couldn't tell. It was too far away. There, another, and yet another. Hopefully none of them were ours. 4 aircraft came down in a screaming dive. 2 Thunderbolts in front, 2 of ours behind. They disappeared on the deck. Something nearby caught fire, an engine roar. Suddenly, a Thunderbolt hurtled right over our field, followed at some 80 meters by a Focke-Wulf. Why hadn't he dropped his belly tank? A dogfight right above us. The Focke-Wulf was in perfect position, firing and obtaining strikes. We looked for cover since it was obvious that the Thunderbolt would soon come crashing down. Keep firing. Man, the Thunderbolt is done for. It's giving you the slip. Keep firing. What was going on? The Thunderbolt pitched over, righted itself, and flew away to the west. What was the matter with the Focke? Such a good position. Keep firing. But it pulled up and flew away. We hit ourselves on our heads. How was such a thing possible? We later learned that it was Lieutenant Stein. His tank wouldn't release. But he had still scored 1 victory before he ran out of ammunition over the field. In the meantime, all had become quiet. What had happened to the others? Hopefully all would return. Restlessly, impatiently, we waited. Had they contacted the enemy again? Finally, our aircraft returned. We heard them first. Then they circled the field. Frege rocked his wings. A victory. Now they landed quickly. There, what is that? Good Lord, drop your landing gear, man. Drop your gear. It was crazy to attempt a belly landing carrying an auxiliary tank. Drop your tank. Too late, he had already set down. Surely it would catch fire, but no, the tank ripped away. Frege and his wingman had to pull up, the other landing long. He finally set down, braking to the very edge of the field. Now the last aircraft came in. All landed quite fast and taxied, braking directly into the woods. No one was missing. Who had smashed his mill in the belly landing? It was the man in my brown 4. Good God, my first-class ship and now a dung heap. What had happened? The engine had puked and quit. Belly landing. Not too much damage, flaps and props smashed. Frege filed his victory claim with the command post. The Gruppe claimed a total of 8 Thunderbolts. Hopefully my brown 4 would soon be operational again. Off duty at 1900, to supper by bus. The Staffel support personnel arrived suddenly, with all our vehicles. We all joined in to help them unpack. At 2200, we heard the cry, "Enemy armor approaching!" The Staffel had to pack up immediately. The pilots packed only the essentials into their aircraft. Great excitement as the Staffel personnel packed. Everyone helped. We pilots loaded the technical services trailer. We could hear the roar of engines. The first armor. By midnight, we had everything taken care of. We went to our rooms and tried to sleep. The second Gruppe's first successful combat since their return to France resulted in considerable overclaiming. Only 3 Thunderbolts were in fact shot down. The Gruppe's opponents had been the 373rd Fighter Group, which were bounced after their runs on Rambouillet by 34 FW-190s. The American pilots claimed 3 FW-190s shot down in return. The second Gruppe lost 2 pilots. A squadron from the 373rd had another run-in with the third Gruppe and some P-51s. The Thunderbolt pilots suffered no losses and claimed 3 Bf-109s shot down. Around the 2nd of September 1944, when Lung was shot down, The Abbeville kids' tour of duty in Western Europe came to an end, and they returned behind the German border. Well, that's the end of the story from the new pilot's perspective. Thanks for watching.